Okay, so let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about ISA 510. Now, you can think of this as the official playbook for an auditor who's new on the scene. They're taking over an audit, and they have to build on work that someone else already did. It's all about one critical question. How do you trust the starting numbers? I mean, we've all been there, right? You take over a project. Maybe it's code from another developer or a kitchen from another chef. Your first instinct is to check everything, to make sure the foundation is solid before you start building on it. Well, that's the exact problem ISA 510 is designed to solve for financial auditors. And believe me, the stakes are incredibly high. And this leads us right into what the standard calls a new auditor's dilemma. It's a situation that happens all the time, but it's one that's just loaded with professional risk. It really demands a very specific, careful approach.
So what exactly is an initial audit engagement? Well, according to the standard, it's one of two scenarios. First, maybe last year's financial statements weren't audited at all. Or, second, they were audited, but by a totally different firm, what the pros call the predecessor auditor. Either way, you, the new auditor, are walking in cold.
And here is the fundamental challenge. An auditor's job is to give their professional opinion on the current year's numbers. But here's the thing. This year's financial story doesn't just start from scratch. Nope, it picks up exactly where last year's story left off. So if those closing numbers from last year, which become this year's starting numbers, are off, then everything that comes after could be wrong too. The standard gives these critical starting numbers a name: opening balances. And they are quite literally the financial foundation for the entire year you're auditing. You can think of it like building a house. If that foundation is cracked, the whole structure is at risk, no matter how perfectly you build the rest of it. So how in the world does an auditor handle this? They can't just cross their fingers and hope for the best. That's why ISA 510 lays out a really clear mission, with two main goals to make sure they can absolutely trust that starting point.
Objective number 1. The auditor has to get enough proof to feel confident that those opening balances are clean. They're on the hunt for any significant errors, what the standard calls misstatements, that are big enough to mess up this year's financial picture. It's really about stopping a problem from the past from poisoning the present.
And objective number 2 is all about consistency. I mean, you have to compare apples to apples, right? The auditor needs to make sure the company is playing by the same accounting rules this year that it used last year. And if they did change the rules, the auditor has to check that the change was made correctly and that everyone knows about it. Okay, so we've got the goals, but how does an auditor actually do it? How do they get the proof they need? Well, the standard gives them a very clear step-by-step investigative playbook to follow. The whole investigation kicks off with some essential homework. The auditor has to read last year's financial statements and, this is super important, the previous auditor's report. That report can hold some major clues. Then they do some basic checks, like, did the numbers from the end of last year literally get copied over correctly to the start of this year? And are those numbers following the right accounting rules? Now, this is where we get into the auditor's main evidence-gathering toolkit. They've got 3 main options. First, they can try to get their hands on the previous auditor's notes, their working papers, to see exactly how they did their work. Second, sometimes the work you do on this year's numbers actually tells you something about last year's. For instance, if a customer pays a big invoice this year, that's pretty good proof the invoice was real at the start of the year. And third, if those don't work, the auditor has to roll up their sleeves and create brand new tests aimed specifically at checking those opening balances. And let's be crystal clear about this. This is not some pick whichever one you feel like menu. The standard is very firm. The auditor must use one or more of these methods to get the proof they need. It's not optional, it's a core requirement of the job. So that brings us to the ultimate question. What happens if the investigation hits a dead end? What if, after all that work, the auditor just can't get the evidence they need about those opening balances? Well, this is where the consequences get very real and very public. If an auditor can't get comfortable with the starting numbers, there's no way they can get comfortable with the final numbers. They have a professional duty to tell everybody who reads the report about this problem. They can't just shrug their shoulders and sign off saying everything looks great. And this table just lays it out perfectly. It shows the direct link between the problem they find and the verdict they have to issue. So if they just can't get the evidence, they issue either a qualified opinion, which is a huge red flag, or a disclaimer of opinion, which basically means we can't give an opinion at all.
And if they actually find a huge mistake or a major inconsistency that the company won't fix, they'll issue that qualified opinion, or even worse, an adverse opinion, which is the audit equivalent of saying the financial statements just can't be trusted.
And this isn't just theory, this is the actual language auditors have to use. This quote is from an example in the standard itself. Listen to what they're saying. We couldn't check the starting inventory numbers, and because that number impacts this year's profit, we can't be sure if this year's profit is correct. It's incredibly direct and powerful.
So let's be really clear here. A report with language like that is a massive deal. It's a direct warning flare to investors, to banks, to anyone who relies on those numbers. It tells them that the independent watchdog has a serious problem with the quality of the information they're looking at.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. We usually think of an audit report as telling the story of one single year. But what ISA 510 really shows us is that a huge part of that story is actually written in its opening chapter, a chapter that might have been penned by someone else entirely. And making sure that first chapter is true, well, that's everything.